Hello, and welcome to another episode of PTR Perspective, a podcast where we dive deeper into electrical equipment markets. I'm Hassan Zahir, co-founder and chief commercial officer at PTR, and I will be your moderator today. In today's episode, we will be diving deeper into submarine cables market, pun intended. We'll be looking at the demand, supply, technology, and innovation of these technologies. On the panel today, I have two highly qualified guests, Marc Jeroense, who's the founder and CEO of MJ MarCable Consulting, and Asad Tariq, who's my colleague and analyst at PTR. Talking about Marc is a highly experienced consultant in the cable industry with over 3 decades of broad and in-depth knowledge. He has held various roles at companies such as NKF, ABB, and NKT, and has played a crucial role in the development and commercialization of HVDC cable systems. Being at the forefront of innovation in HVDC for the renewable sector, Marc has been involved in the development and qualification of the world record 525 and 640 kV extruded DC cable systems. With his consulting company, MarCable Consulting, Marc provides a range of services, including technical and strategic advisory, developing technical specifications, clarification meetings, cable system courses, and cable testing and inspection. And if that was not enough, he's also an active member of CGRI and has contributed to several standards on these topics. We're super excited to have you with us, Marc, today.
Thank you, Hassan.
Along with Marc, we have Asad Tariq. Asad is working as an analyst at PTR, where he specializes in analyzing the market of modern grid technologies. With this deep understanding of HVDC systems, onshore power supply systems, which are also called cold ironing systems, as well as flexible AC transmission systems, Asad provides our clients valuable insights into the latest market developments on these rapidly evolving technologies. He comes from a very strong technical background, having previously worked as a research assistant at US-Pakistan Center for Advanced Studies in Energy, as well as being a published author in different scientific journals, including Elsevier's Science Direct. Welcome to the podcast, Asad.
Thank you, Hassan.
All right, jumping right into it, like on the first topic, I want to start with the discussion on the current demand of submarine cables globally. And a question to both of you. Post-COVID, we saw a spike in renewables, cross-border interconnections, and oil and gas development rates. It was almost like the projects were delayed and now they're picking up. What are your views on the impact of these post-COVID developments on the submarine cable industry from a demand standpoint? Do you think DC will overtake AC cable technology?
Well, maybe I said I can just start the answering the question. I think to truly answer that question, it deserves first to zoom out a bit and go back in time, and just to understand and appreciate the remarkable changes we are seeing. The post-Second World War era was characterized by building and rebuilding the European grid. More power generation was built and local national grids became connected. But mostly we were still talking about overhead lines and extra high voltage cables being more the exception. In the late 60s, we observed the birth of polymer high voltage power cables. It took some decades for polymer cables to increase the voltage and volumes to 400 kV AC, at least if we talk about noticeable volumes. The few long interconnectors at that time used HVDC voltage, and the cables were still of the paper and oil type, or more correctly, mass impregnated MI cables. In the 90s, then the first polymer HVDC cables were introduced, but still at moderate volumes of a few hundreds kilometers at most. But it is from here on, I really want to draw your attention, because the 90s were the starting point of deregulation and electricity started to get traded. And then both the demand and supply of AC and DC cables got a boost. In the following decade, passing 2010-ish, a new DC voltage level was introduced. The 320 kV level was able to transmit 1 gigawatt of power, and that was then in the order of magnitude of a nuclear power plant or a big offshore wind park. And the global polymer DC cable supply could then be measured at about 1,000 kilometers a year. And then it continued in 2014 with the introduction of 525 kV DC. a voltage level to transmit roughly 2 gigawatts. Even a new supply era was enabled. Now we're talking about a decennium with global production of about, say, 4,000 kilometer polymer HVDC cables per year. And this is just the beginning, it seems. And let us not forget that MI cables still play a role, but to a lesser degree in terms of comparable future volumes. And of course, 3 core HVAC cables, Submarine, to connect wind farms were developed and also still in use. And what I think is remarkable is the increase in speed of development and project implementation. Whereas doubling the voltage and commercializing it is normally a matter of 10 to 20 years, we now see this happening at a much faster pace. 80 kV HVDC was introduced and commercialized in '98, and a little bit more than 15 years later, we arrived at 525 kV. It's a 6-fold increase. I think the interesting thing with HVDC is that the reason for its existence are the large transmission lengths and powers. The higher the voltage, the larger these become. So increasing transmission voltage almost automatically means an increase in the demand and supply of DC cables. And yet another characteristic of these large projects is that a lot of money and time are involved. We talk about hundreds of millions of euros or now billions of euro projects. And the time from project idea to finalization is easily 10 years. So the projects are also often of high infrastructural, regional and national importance. And this means altogether that such projects are not easily stopped. And I think therefore we saw that the COVID pandemic had no significant braking effect on the cable business. Well, at least not the large project part of it. So Europe has been the front runner in terms of high-end cable production. The volume of DC cables is the largest in Europe so far, but America is now seeing an awakening and several projects are emerging and being exercised. Some examples are the SOO Green HVDC link and the Champlain Hudson Power Express project. So what do you say, Asad?
Sure, Mark. So basically, if we talk about the global demand, so it has been steadily increasing over the years, even prior to COVID and during the COVID and after the COVID as well. So the global demand for the submarine cables has increased by over 50% in 2022, and it was accounting nearly 2.1 billion USDs. And the major demand was driven by the power generation sector, as the more and more nations are moving towards the green energy transition. If we talk about the key markets, so APEC and European markets are the front runners, and followed by the North America and the GCC region. In Europe, the EU member states have set lofty targets of deploying 60 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which will be driving an increase in the demand of the submarine cables. Similarly, if we talk about the United Kingdom, as it intends to increase the offshore wind production by 40 gigawatts by 2030, and it will definitely drive the development of roughly 25 gigawatt of the HVDC transmission capacity by the same year. If we talk about the Asia Pacific market, so despite the COVID and the global inflation, the regional market grew by 41% in 2021 compared to 2020, as countries emerged from the lockdowns and multiple projects that had been stalled in 2020 were finished on time. So the major demand for the cables was driven by the transmission sector in the Chinese market. And if we talk about the North American market, so the region has also seen a rise in the demand of the cables as USA begins to upgrade their transmission infrastructure with plans to increase its HVDC transmission capacity up to 30 gigawatts by 2025. In addition, the South American nations, including Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Colombia, they will also be driving the demand for the cables with the planned HVDC capacity addition of nearly 40 gigawatts in short to medium term. So coming towards the GCC region, we have seen that in 2021, a significant year-on-year growth of 500% was there. And Saudi Arabia and UAE were the leading markets in the region, which accounted for nearly 50% and 39% of the market shares. However, the KSA market may experience a decline in the coming years due to the lack of the major projects, as the oil market is encountering uncertainties and the global inflation is there. On the other hand, the UA market is poised to overtake the KSA market with an expected market potential of nearly 487 million USDs in short to medium term as the oil and gas sector is ramping up over there. So that are my views related to this, the global demand.
So very interesting, starting from the technology and how it evolved over the years and how it's still today very significantly important, COVID, post-COVID, and then statistics that are basically yelling at us that the market is going to grow in the future. Let's dig a bit deeper into that, like looking at the different application verticals that you guys briefly touched upon as well, which are driving this demand. And then also looking at different regions in a bit more detail as well. Let's maybe start with you, Mark. One of the verticals that you mentioned was offshore wind, right? Offshore wind is gaining a lot of traction in Europe as more and more nations are progressing towards their energy transition targets. And it's located outside of the mainland, right? Interconnectors are located beyond boundaries and regions. How do you think this increase in offshore wind has influenced the internal grid structure, and what does that mean for submarine cables demand situation?
Well, that's a bunch of interesting questions. Let me try to answer that. I think any generation of power that is located an appreciable distance from centers of consumption like cities or big industries, that needs transmission. And that can be overhead lines or cables. And here also I want to highlight that there is nothing wrong with either of those. Sometimes cables are a better choice and sometimes overhead lines. The choice depends on many factors like technology, economy, social acceptance, you name it. But in case the generation is offshore, like the incredibly fast growing segment of offshore wind, cables are the only sensible solution. So when Europe or America sets ambitious targets for the implementation of offshore wind, this is immediately translated into cable demand and supply. And just as an example, I think Asad already was into it, and that in 2021, the EU presented its strategy on offshore renewable energy, aiming to increase Europe's offshore wind capacity from the 2021 level of about 12 gigawatts to at least 60 gigawatts by 2030, and think about it, and to 300 gigawatts by 2050. There is a late McKinsey report that looks at the global installed offshore wind capacity that's expected to reach more than 600 gigawatts by 2050. From a level of 40 gigawatts in 2020. So it's an enormous increase. And offshore wind there is a significant driver where the numbers will end up with a lot of cables. Now, interconnectors in Europe, they connect regions and nations, often cross seas. So where we talk submarine cables too. In addition, interconnectors are used for trading and security of supply. So we quite often, if not always, talk about large powers and high voltages. And here again, HVDC cables are the preferred choice. And as we are talking about crossing waters, overhead lines make no sense. In Europe, in the North Sea region, we see a grid structure growing that goes beyond the traditional A to B linear connections. We see a grid growing, a subsea grid where interconnectors, offshore wind, energy islands are connected in a clever and redundant way. New technology is developed, although I think no leapfrogs are really needed. The technology we have today is to a large extent ready to do the job. And all this electricity that is transmitted from the sea into countries also need a significant strengthening of the nation's on-land grids. The German corridor projects are a well-known example where hundreds of kilometers of 525 kV cables are installed, and these are necessary to transmit the electricity from the north to the south. This is, I hope, answering the question, Hassan.
Yep, absolutely. So this is a good overview of Europe, right? If we were to kind of go beyond Europe, what do you think are the application verticals driving the demand for submarine cables beyond Europe? For example, in Middle East, for example, in North America, maybe Asad, because you work more on the Middle Eastern market as well. Maybe you start with Middle East and then Mark, you can give some flavor on the North American market.
Sure. Well, when it comes to the key application verticals driving the demand for the submarine cables in the regional markets, it is important to note that the GCC region stand out from the others. Especially the demand for the submarine cables in the GCC region is largely attributed to the need of supplying electric power to offshore oil rigs. Over the past few years, the demand for the submarine cables has experienced a significant upswing in the GCC countries, particularly in Saudi Arabia and UAE, due to expansion in the oil and gas sector. However, the KSA market may face a decline in the coming years owing to the lack of major projects due to the uncertainty of the oil market and the global inflation. However, on the other hand, the UAE market is projected to surpass the KSA market and demonstrate a potential of nearly 487 million USDs in short to medium term. The UAE market anticipated growth is mainly driven by the extensive offshore projects like ADNOC, which is generating a significant amount of investment in the region. Moreover, the expansion of the power transmission is another factor which is driving the regional market for the submarine cables in Middle East, with a couple of under construction cross-border HVDC interconnections, like the Saudi Arabia and Jordan link and the Saudi Arabia and Egypt HVDC link, with the combined cable length of nearly 1,500 kilometers, expected to be commissioned by 2025. Additionally, KSA is planning to establish a cross-border HVDC interconnection with India as well, which will require submarine cable to cover almost 1,600 kilometers of distance, with the deepest point being 3.5 kilometers in the sea. So these are the major expansions that are being going on when it comes towards the submarine cable market in the Middle East region.
Right. Let me then take over and say add some words, Asad, for the North America region. I think with the new US administration, offshore wind has now become a significant driver. An example of America is the offshore wind project in the New York area. The offshore wind prices, but now also state level commitments and the huge expansion into new leasing areas that drove the US offshore wind pipeline to grow about 13.5% over 2021, with 40 gigawatts now in various stages of development. And you know, there are various projects ongoing, like the coastal Virginia offshore wind, the ocean wind 1 and 2, Sunrise Wind, Empire Wind, Vineyard Wind, you name it. It's quite a long list. Another example of the awakening of projects in the US is a long link being realized interconnecting Canada with New York, the Champlain Hudson Power Express, that will facilitate transmission of sustainable hydropower from Canada down to New York City. About 1.2 or 1.3 gigawatts, transmission line is one of the largest infrastructure investments in the history of New York. And it will become a substantial contribution to the state's ambition of at least, I think, 70% of power generation and consumption coming from renewable energy sources by 2030. And then we have the SOO Green HVDC project. SOO Green will connect two of the largest electricity markets in the US. The Midwestern market, where renewable energy is abundant and rather inexpensive, and the Eastern market, where clean energy demand is strong, but more difficult and costly to develop. So SOO Green will run along the rail right-of-way from central Iowa to eastern Illinois, delivering more than 2 gigawatts of power to the eastern US. And now, on top of that, and now leaving a little bit the US to be honest, but we have the old ideas that seem to become reality, where we connect vast amounts of solar and wind energy from desert regions in North Africa to Europe, or particularly countries like the UK. X-Links is such an example. The Sun Cable project, which is currently on hold, but can be revived again maybe, transmitting solar power from Australia to the Singapore area. And such projects will become reality, I think, if not immediately now, then in the foreseeable future. So we do see a dramatic increase in the demand for cables as a response to the plans for new extensive grid connections, offshore wind and interconnectors, as well as the emergence of mega projects. I think that's summarizing hopefully a little bit the question.
I mean, it's like it's phenomenal the amount of development happening right within the countries, interconnected between countries. There is intercontinental interconnectors, right, connecting Saudi Arabia to India, connecting North Africa to Europe, is like huge mega projects. The follow-up question I have, like moving a bit from the demand to the supply side, maybe starting with you, Mark. How do you think is the current landscape from the supply side? Do you think we have enough manufacturing capacity to actually address all of these projects, like from a submarine cables perspective?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Hassan, and thank you for that. There are some things to be said about that. I think the supply demand, of course, on a mid and long-term basis should ideally be in balance. In the 90s, if we look back in time, the supply side of the industry went through a painful process, to be honest. Many factories were closed because there was an imbalance. But the following 2 decennia were characterized by building new factories and investments in new production lines. But this was done at a comparably low pace and with careful monitoring of the conditions, as one could understand, because one was afraid to make the same mistakes and over-invest again. But now, when the demand side is simply exploding and asks the supply side to respond, it seems that the old psychological barriers are still there. But I think there are clear signs now that trust in the future weathers these barriers away. I see new business models are developed. Long-term agreements allow the supply side to invest and expand in a responsible manner. It's now more and more about partnership, I think.
So does that mean that there is going to be new manufacturing facilities in short to the medium term, and maybe also new market entrants who are entering this market? What do you guys think? Maybe starting with you, Asad, if you want to comment on that, and then kind of circling back to you, Mark. What do you think is the impact of this current situation?
Well, when it comes to the potential for new entrants and manufacturing facilities in short and medium term, it is important to consider the current state of the regional market. So if I talk about the GCC submarine cable market, so it accounts nearly 2% of the overall global market. This low demand does not encourage significant capital investment in local manufacturing. As of now, if we talk about the region, only JPS Saudi is the only submarine power cable manufacturer in the region, which is producing and selling only medium voltage XLPE subsea cables with the rating not more than 35 kilovolt for power transmission and communication lines. So as a result, the market is still relies on the international players such as Nexans, Prysmian, NKT, and Sumitomo Electric, which are not there physically, like they do not have any manufacturing site over there, but still they are managing to supply the demand for the region, as it's not more than 2%. So I don't think so that in the coming near term, any new facility or manufacturing facility will be over there.
What are your thoughts, Mark?
Well, I think I said that the current landscape is that of investing in existing plants to start with, and I agree with you, Asad, that the companies you named, they are indeed investing as we speak. But also, I think starting to build completely new production plants there where markets all of a sudden are growing, like the factory being built by Prysmian in the US as an answer to the growing opportunities exactly there. But another way is to start further partnerships between suppliers. And the late example is the new announced joint venture of NKT and Valsiliva, where a new submarine cable factory will be built in Taiwan. And then we have, regarding the possible realization of mega projects like X-Links or Sun Cable, then dedicated new factories will be needed and are discussed, and rather long-going plans do exist. X-Links has the project to connect Morocco with the UK, intends at least to build a factory in Scotland named XLCC. And that will be an example of a new player entering the field. And that does not happen that often. But we should recognize that extraordinary times might need extraordinary actions as well, isn't it?
Yeah. So basically what you're saying, if I was to summarize, is that in the short term, there's going to be investment in capacity expansions of the existing plants. And you see that in the medium to long term, more players coming to the market and more factories being set up. How do you see that impacting? Because there is a demand supply situation going on right now. Then, how do you see that impacting the current lead times on the cables or prices of submarine cables in the market today?
So looking at the current status of lead times and prices for the submarine cables, particularly in the GCC region. So the region heavily rely on the foreign manufacturers for these cables. As a result, the global demand fluctuations and supply chains interruptions can significantly impact the region. Currently, there are several challenges impacting the lead times and prices for the submarine cables in GCC. Supply chain issues and higher freight costs have resulted in longer lead times. On average, lead time have increased like by 2 to 3 months due to a variety of factors, which includes the Chinese lockdown due to COVID, high energy costs, causing OEMs to delay order, and looming market recessions resulting in the low business confidence. Overall, these challenges are likely to continue impacting the submarine cable market in the GCC region when it comes towards the short to medium term, which could lead to high prices and longer lead times for the consumers. It will be important for the industry players to monitor these trends and work to mitigate any potential risk to ensure a stable and reliable supply of submarine cables in the GCC region, particularly.
Mark, do you share the same sentiment from a Western markets perspective?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I do see these trends. All these different kinds of investments that we just talked about all together, they have in the end the goal of decreasing the lead times, because currently they are rather high, especially for the high-end cables and submarine cables. And with several multi-billion euro projects, the supply side is fully booked. And with the current manufacturing capability, the lead times will be years. So investments must come in place to decrease those. And it's happening. I mean, let's face it. And mechanisms are being put in place all to accomplish that. I think the big challenge in my eyes is to get people to run all the new factories and projects. It's because on a scale, on a comparative scale, it's more challenging to get the right educated people in place fast enough to meet the demand side, as compared to the very impressive, although investments in concrete and steel, in factories. So I would love to see more action on that.
Absolutely. I think the problem with the skilled workforce is there across the power grid industry, not just submarine cable side. Let's walk away from the supply demand situation for a second, and let's talk about innovation in the cable technologies. XLPE, the crosslink polyethylene, has been kind of gaining traction across the globe as the de facto go-to innovation technology. Are there any new innovations happening in this domain, like given all of this increasing demand and mega projects? And when would we see them actually being implemented in the industry? Maybe starting with you, Mark, on this one, and then we'll go to Asad.
Right. Thanks, Hassan. First, let's recognize that we are now in a very interesting phase with a high focus on cable. I think the industry should find a balance between, on the one hand side, the status quo and staying at the sweet spots of technology where we are now, and on the other side, introducing new inventions. With that, not saying that no new inventions should take place, but we must focus on the increased effort we need to deliver the technology we have in enormous quantities with the right and high quality. But if I would elaborate and look about in the future on what possible technological innovations we could see in the future, it might be partly increased operating temperature of certain types of polymer HVDC cable. There are versions that can withstand higher temperatures. XLPE is still a little bit lagging behind. I think that will change. That would increase transmission capacity if there are no constraints by loss requirements. The Mediterranean needs cables to be installed at extreme depths. Progress is being made, and here I expect more too. And well, Asad, you also mentioned the need for high depth installation in some parts of the East. Mm-hmm. We might see more superconducting cables. They are still in a niche market, but that niche might grow, who knows? if somebody would come up with a conducting material that has significantly reduced resistance at room temperature, that would be a major breakthrough. Another area of invention might be the even better ways to monitor the cables. Currently, temperature and vibrations can be monitored along certain lengths of the cable. So there are length limitations, but the borders of these are constantly pushed here. Offshore wind is going to deeper waters, so more applications of dynamic cables will be needed, not only for inter-array cables, but also for the heavier export cables. I think these are the things I just see ahead of me.
So, what do you think?
Sure. I will the comments from the Marc. So XLPE cables certainly will be stealing the spotlight, but the industry is constantly evolving and advancing with the new technologies to meet the growing demand for reliable and efficient energy transition is must. So we can see that the emerging submarine cable technologies such as dynamic cable rating and the optical fibers, they are coming into the market as they enable the transmission of data in addition to the power. Which could enable the use of real-time data to calculate the maximum safe current carrying capacities of the submarine cable. So I think this is how the market is moving, not only from transmitting energy, but the data with it as well.
So exciting innovations, huge mega projects and demand, growth in supply. How do you see the global market evolving? Like, what's the outlook like for submarine cables moving forward? Maybe Asad, if you want to continue on that, and then we'll circle back to Marc.
Yes, sure. So the demand for the submarine cables is indeed set to increase in the coming years due to the growing need for integrating renewable, especially offshore wind, into the power grid and the rising number of cross-border interconnections. In the short to medium term, the global submarine market is expected to grow with an average of nearly 45%. The major growth is expected to be driven by the development of high voltage direct current technology worldwide, which is estimated to result in the installation of nearly 50,000 kilometers of the submarine cables by 2030. And all of this demand will be majorly coming from the Europe, which is expected to account for nearly 55% of the total submarine cable deployment, followed by APEC, which will account 33%, and Americas, which will be accounting 12% of this deployment. So the ongoing geopolitical issues are also over there, which is impacting the oil and gas sector globally. And this will affect the GCC market, if we talk in particularly the KSA being the most affected in the region. However, due to the ongoing expansion of the oil and gas sector in the UAE, the demand for the submarine cable is expected to rise in that part of the world from 3% to 10% in the coming 5 years. So overall, we can expect the emergence of new markets and demand centers for the submarine cables in the future, as the world increasingly relies on the submarine cables for efficient and reliable transmission energy. This market is going to increase.
Okay, Marc, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I've just for sure the same vision as Asad is summarizing. I think we have already mentioned a number of things the last couple of minutes. But if I summarize, I think I see several things happening. First, as said, the existing production locations will be enlarged by investment in new production lines. Secondly, I think I see the possibility of new joint ventures between existing players that can result in newly built factory locations, predominantly at locations where new markets see increased volumes. And thirdly, again, the ideas have been old but never realized in the past. Now or soon might be the time for the realization of these mega projects that need new players that invest in new assets. But most importantly, or at least also important, I see new business models growing between the demand and supply side that create financial and contractual comfort for investment in employees and new assets. This takes shape, I think, in the form of these long-term and frame agreements we see upcoming.
So exciting present and even more exciting future. I think now we are at the end of this very interesting discussion in this episode. Any concluding remarks from your side, Marc, and also Asad? Yeah,
well, it's indeed a very exciting time. if one wants to be somewhere in time, it's now. Now everything is happening. The electricity grid is an enormous responsible part of the world. Without energy, without electricity, the world will collapse in various ways, which we don't want. We see a future that we need even more of that, and to be part of that now. To be part of that industry, which is so exciting and growing with such a bright future, which will help humanity to become even better. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, I totally agree with the Mark, and I would take it as that submarine cables are now the vital component of the global infrastructure. As they are enabling the power transmission not between the countries but between the continents. And as the industry continues to evolve and new demand centers will emerge, we can look forward to the further exploring the fascinating world of the submarine cables and their crucial role in connecting the power economies across the globe.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark and Asad, for taking your time out and doing this episode with us. If you need any technical or strategic advisory, please reach out to Mark on MJ MarCable Consulting. And of course, if you need any information on submarine cables market, please reach out to us at PTR. I would like to thank you both once again for your time. And I would also like to thank the sponsor of this episode, Power Systems Technology, which is the leading publication on electrical equipment around the world, who's sponsoring this episode. Thank you so much for your time. And, we look forward to the next episodes.
Thank you, Assam.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.